Hi, I'm Suzanne Ellingham. I'm the show director for Source Fashion, and we are recording some very special podcast episodes for Honest Not Perfect here on the show floor. And for this session, I'm joined by Mark Faithfull, Forbes contributor, journalist, chair of World Retail Congress.
Not chair, no, but I work with World Retail Congress.
Okay, I'm gonna give you a senior brand for that one. And general retail contributor, commentator.
Yeah.
So I think one of the interesting things, and one of the reasons I was quite happy to do this, is I think, Mark, you have exposure to retail in a lot of different elements, from real estate to retailers to brands, and really get involved in a lot of very different conversations. So I think one of the things that we try to do with these podcasts is just get some really honest views on what's happening in certain areas, where we're seeing change, and actually maybe talking about people who are doing things really well, and even potentially people who aren't doing very well, and where we think there could be tweaks. But it's all about just kind of honest feedback. There's a lot going on in the world of retail at the moment. What's the thing that you're most interested in at the moment? The thing that you're thinking that could be interesting?
I think that the first thing to say is that we're obviously going through yet another period of remarkable volatility, and I think that's becoming quite dominant for retailers. I was saying earlier on when we were doing one of the fireside chat sessions that, when we used to talk about things at shows like this, it used to be about retail strategy and fashion trends and obviously sustainability and all the things that go with that. But, there is no doubt that macro trends, political uncertainty, whether that be in conflict, whether it be the tariffs, it's just really causing a very, very volatile backdrop for retailers, and obviously it's something that is dominating a lot of their thoughts. At the same time, they're trying to get on with a day job and do interesting things. So yeah, it's certainly a very interesting time. I think we're at a point where the retailers that are in existence have proved remarkably resilient, because they've had a long period of major upheavals, and the ones that have come through the other side, obviously in strong position, they're predominantly strong businesses. This is yet another challenge for them.
Yeah, it's interesting because you started that in actually almost the same way that I talk about the market at the moment. When we think about trade show content, it's usually, like you say, it's about strategy, it's about day to day. As a fashion show, it's usually about incoming trends for next year. It's about sustainability goals. It's about how we move towards those environmental targets that everyone wants to move to. And when we started doing research with our communities for this show, the tone and the conversation was so different. And the conversation was around more, why aren't we moving forward? Do people not care? It's like, why are we not talking about sustainability? Why are we not talking about how far we are from 2030 goals? And it came down to a really simple truth that actually people are almost putting off those things until the business and the landscape is more stable, so that what they're able to do is concentrate on kind of getting through the period of uncertainty and volatility, and then concentrate on those great things that they really want to do. But actually, if you think about it, we've had COVID, we've had obviously the pandemic, we've had conflict, commodity prices changing, supply chain upheavals. We're starting to see the impact of tariffs and how that's causing a bit of supply chain chaos. And the reality is this is the new normal now. Like, it's been 5 or 6 years of dealing with this volatility. And for the first time as a fashion trade show, we're putting on sessions on commodity fluctuations and forecasts into next year. And we are talking about strategies to de-risk. And I think what was interesting, and this came out of quite a lot of our ad board meetings, was the tools that those really big businesses have that have resilience are things that the SMEs and those smaller businesses who probably need to be moving more on that track, they're things that they don't necessarily think about. And commodities is an interesting one. I would speak to most kind of small to mid-sized businesses, and they don't understand the impact of that and why they should be looking at that in terms of their risk profile and how that could impact what they're buying next year. And it feels that risk is really the conversation now, even more, because and how you move forward in a high-risk environment, but still do the things that you want to do. It's like, if this is normal, how do we still move forward?
Yeah, certainly. And I think we're looking at a period where diversification is starting to become much more important. There was quite a bit of talk about nearshoring after the pandemic and about bringing production closer to the end consumer. We've seen a little bit of that, although I think still at the moment that hasn't really played out heavily.
You know what? We were hearing a lot of that coming out of COVID. I remember seeing like a McKinsey report that was talking about how 70 to 80% of the businesses are looking to nearshore or bring production close to home. And actually, fast forward 2 or 3 years later, it's maybe only 10% that's moved closer. Do you think there's a real intent to now bring some of that production close to home, if only to de-risk around the Suez Canal?
I think we might see it as a trend, but I think you're right. It's probably not going to be a major factor. It's probably just going to be a small part of it. I mean, we were looking at probably Mexico as the nearshore for the US, but then now you have the tariff question. We're talking about places like Turkey perhaps being closer to Europe than some of the source countries, and that, or perhaps some of the Far East and European countries being used for the nearshoring. Again, there is a lot of political uncertainty around a lot of those markets, so that does seem to have stalled to some extent. I think what we are seeing is that clearly there are certain markets that are being much more heavily impacted or potentially impacted by tariffs than others. We're seeing a lot of pressure on China, clearly from the US. So I think we are going to see retailers perhaps multi-sourcing, so choosing several markets they can source from, so that they do have more opportunities to be more agile and to bend with whatever happens next.
I think the US tariffs is an interesting conversation because we obviously see it from a retailer perspective in the US, but then we experience it from the other side, how the manufacturers are responding to that. And I was lucky enough to be in Hong Kong when the US elections happened. So I heard a lot of very genuine, honest kind of reactions to that. There was no real shock. I think they kind of expected it, but it was very much a sense of resignation that they kind of knew that this was coming. And I think there was a wait and see mentality as to how much of their business would be taken up. But I think what we're seeing now, certainly from a sourcing perspective, some of the things that we're hearing in terms of the export agencies in China, they're looking to support their manufacturers to refocus away from the US. I remember listening to one very large US manufacturer whose instant reaction to the tariffs was that our manufacturers and our supply chain can essentially suck that up. I don't think they're prepared to suck it up, and there just aren't the margins there for them to do so. So I think it's interesting how different countries will react to those tariffs, but I think it gives the opportunity for maybe UK, Europe, and I think the trade deal that was renegotiated a few months ago by the government, I think gives us a much easier import-export route into Europe. And I think the only potential positive that could come out of these US tariffs is that import-exports between UK and Europe could become easier.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the interesting thing is that certainly some markets can be heavily impacted. There is a likelihood that there are going to be some sparser or empty shelves in the US from some of the markets, which means there's a vacuum to be filled. The fact of the matter is that vacuum is not going to be filled by US manufacture because it's still going to be way too expensive. And also you'd have to deal with production processes in order to set up manufacturing. So who is
Not quite ready for it.
No, I mean, it's going to take, well, at least 1 or 2 years for something like that to be brought to scale. And then will it ever be able to be done economically at scale in the US? It's extremely unlikely. So who is going to benefit? Obviously, there's a lot of talk about India being a possible beneficiary. There was talk about Vietnam, for example, being hit very hard now that there's possibility of their tariffs being dropped. One of the things is that this situation is changing all the time as well.
I think one of the interesting countries that came out of that tariff group was Egypt. They were hit with 10% tariff in the same rate as the UK. I thought that was interesting. I think it's interesting because we're seeing there's quite an aggressive export policy from Egypt to start to get their factories out. Obviously, there are challenges within Egypt in terms of labour, in terms of quality, ease of doing business. But I thought it was really significant that the US only applied 10% to Egypt, which makes me think, I wonder what they're seeing there. Because I think the same with Turkey. I think Turkey had a relatively small tariff impact as well. It's a huge textile manufacturer. So it's interesting when you look at the economies where those tariffs were almost ignored. But Egypt being one that they ignored was one that definitely stood out to me.
Yeah, I mean, that's very interesting and an opportunity clearly for a sort of nascent sector. But then, as you say, when you look at Turkey, which has an incredible manufacturing heritage and high quality, I think one of the interesting things as well is for the major brands, they've spent a lot of time quality assuring all these different production facilities, because obviously there was a lot of pressure on them from what's happened in the past. If they're going to start sourcing from different countries, there's going to be a huge amount of pressure on them to actually make sure that those places are ethical, environmentally sustainable, and all the things that go with it.
And I think one of the conversations that we have is not just on the ethical and the sustainable, it's actually one of the conversations around how you make nearshoring economically viable. Because obviously profit still needs to be made, there still needs to be margins in it, but I think there's a wider conversation happening at the moment in the community around minimum order quantities and overproduction, and actually how buyers and sourcing kind of for these big brands are incentivized. It's all very well incentivizing your buyer to buy the cheapest thing possible and make the most margin. But if that is done, if they're only ever bonused on in margin and not the total cost of range, you're ending up with huge costs of production on the other side. So I think it's a really interesting moment in time at the moment around that near sourcing conversation. And I think there's a real conversation on actually how do we make this work? Because if you look at the actual volumes of things that are sold in the UK, I think in stat I saw was something in the region of only 40% of what's produced for the UK is actually sold. The rest of it is mass produced and sits there. And I think that's a real conversation that needs to be taken into how do you make nearshoring work? Well, you can make it work if you're just actually making what you're going to sell. So it'll be interesting for me. I think that's one thing I'll be interested to see playing out, because I think once the overproduction, the total cost of range comes in and the sheer volume of what's sitting there on waste, as well as the change to the EPR regulations, I think we'll start to see a shift in some of that production coming close to home, certainly for the UK side.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're right. I think it is probably going to be regulation-led, and clearly there's quite a lot going on in Europe, which is going to start driving that, and is going to make some big changes. And we know that fashion, has been responsible for a lot of waste, both in terms of the production, overproduction, what happens while it's being produced. So it's going to be an industry that goes under increasing scrutiny. I think it's going to be very interesting to see how consumers feel about things. They have been sort of fed on fast fashion for a long time. There's a lot of people who bend their ethics depending on what they like and whether they see something they want. And so yeah, there's a as you say, there are a lot of moving parts. I definitely think we're just in an interesting time generally, and I'm going to throw it in there that so we've got AI now, which means that perhaps some of these predictive models become much more accurate.
Do it's interesting because some of the biggest businesses that have produced, and I'm thinking of one particular company, and I'm not going to name them. There's one particular company that I'm thinking of that has very data-led systems. And it's probably one of the biggest culprits of overproduction in the UK. And it's interesting because you think if they have data, even with the AI predictive models, if they're not using the data they have that's fairly accurate, how will AI impact that? I think AI is one of those topics that is going to impact every single part of the retail supply chain. And an interesting debate that we're having, that we've been talking about, that we're here in our circles, is around actually how much should be AI-led? What shouldn't be AI-led? It's like, where can this benefit retail and where can it maybe be an ethical question that we're looking at? What do you think? Where do you think the biggest wins are for AI?
Well, there's a question.
I know, I love it. What comes to mind first?
I think the first thing I would say is that I've heard a lot of retailers talking this year about the fact that they've got to get AI working in a practical way, whether it be small things or big things, but rather than just testing. The testing days are over, and they've got to start executing. I think one of the most interesting areas, and it very much plays into supply chain, might be weather, which obviously plays into environmentals on every side, which is that, surely one of the things that AI will be able to do is predict what weather conditions mean for the sourcing of different products, the base commodity products.
That's super interesting.
And what that might mean for supply chains. So yeah, I think that could be a really interesting area. And also for the supply chain in terms of getting ships from one side of the world to the other, in terms of whether they might be facing, what sort of clothes people might be needing. Obviously we're going through a very long, hot summer in the UK at the moment, which is unusual. But will AI be able to predict that more accurately going forward so that the retailers will have the right clothes in for the right climate that we're experiencing?
I never would have thought, I don't know why, but that's made my mind now thinking about 10 different directions, because it's true. If you could accurately predict weather conditions, then yes, there's the shipping and the containers. There's the consumer behaviour and how much more summer rather than winter, what they may need. Obviously, huge amounts of AI around consumer behaviour and and a lot of the kind of work that some of the big Chinese retailers do in terms of predictive design and generative design. But what I think is really interesting is using that really to predict soil conditions, because that'll impact commodity prices, cotton prices, and actually it really does impact. And I think we often forget how much the weather does impact. We think, oh, it's a rainy day, but actually if there's going to be a region of India that produces lots of cotton that's likely to be more waterlogged than usual, that has a huge knock-on effect on prices of ranges.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, we're obviously seeing just in the last few days, we've had the heat dome over the Europe.
Yeah.
We've had the flash floods in Texas. You don't have to go back more than a few days to see an extreme climate event. And that's just happening all the time now, it would seem. So.
Yeah, I think that's great insight. I think, yeah. It's funny because now I'm thinking about it and I'm not talking, so.
It's just not the art of the podcast.
No, it's not the art of the podcast. It's not often somebody stumps me and think, oh, that's really interesting. Where do you think, and second big question, the flip side of that, where do you think AI could potentially be more damaging than good? Do you think there's an area of retail that you think should be protected or wouldn't benefit from AI, giving it a bit of a boost?
I mean, I think the first thing I should caveat before I answer this is I am definitely not an AI expert, and I'm learning as I go along, like everyone else.
We all are.
But I guess the question is when it starts replacing jobs, isn't it? Really, I think that it's all very well to look at efficiencies, but we start losing people there. And again, real world example, not from retail. There's been the controversy at Wimbledon this week about the line calls and somebody switching the machine off. And kind of the loss of the humanization of having those line call judges there. Maybe it seems like a bit of a sort of try point, but that is something that brings a little bit of colour to a tournament. It might be more efficient, but is it beneficial? I'm not sure. And so I guess anywhere where the AI takes away from things that people like, the human connections that people like, and takes people's jobs away, I think you have to start thinking very carefully about
And
this.
I think some of the conversations that I've seen and heard around AI is process efficiency. And I think most of us, whenever we see the word process efficiency, it generally means redundancies, job reductions. But I think the places where really there is, I would say, it needs to be protected is around the creativity side. I think everyone would love to say if AI could do my ironing for me so I could free myself up to write or create, then that's great. It's like, actually, I don't need AI to do my creativity for me. I'd like it to do the mundane things that kind of just give what I call low value tasks. But I think it'll be interesting to see how that develops and how retail reacts to that behind the scenes. But I know from a lot of the very kind of senior people that we speak to, it's kind of their concern as well, is actually when we get to a stage where we become so reliant on it, that's actually when we need to maybe just pull back and just have somebody to sanity check from time to time. We touched on something before we went down the AI rabbit hole. Consumer behaviour. It's another conversation that we've had over the last few seasons at the show, is around when are consumers actually going to start paying more for better products? Is it ever going to happen? Do we think it's a pipe dream?
I think it's very, very difficult because for as long as I've been reporting about retail, if you ask people, they say they like to buy responsibly and sustainably, and they will pay a premium. But when you see consumer behaviour, it very rarely matches up. There are obviously consumers that do. There are retailers that have based, a lot of what they do around ethics and have done well. But when you look at it in the mainstream, consumer behaviour just doesn't seem to stack up. And I'm not quite sure how you align it. I don't know is the answer. And I think that even if you look at Gen Z, who you'd have thought would be much more educated than people who are older than them, they're still, Shein is a big Gen Z favourite. And they might go and buy ethical, they might rent, they might, repair, but they are still buying from fast fashion retailers. So, consumers are complex, and I'm really not sure how you unlock that, I have to be honest. I think if there were retailers that knew how to do it, they would be doing it by now.
Yeah, that's true. I think so. One of the people who we had at the show earlier was Nick Reed from Neem. And he said something really interesting with him. It stuck with me. He said, for them, they find that Gen X, the over 45s, tend to be the people who do actually buy more ethically. And I said to him, why do you think that is? Because we would assume that younger consumers are more connected, and it's always reported quite widely that younger consumers may care a little bit more or they're more ethical, but the reality is they maybe don't have the same levels of income or disposable income as the older generation. And I said, do you think it's because we were the generation, kind of me included, the over 45s, do you think it's because we're the generation where we remember deposit return schemes, where we remember repair and actually reuse, and maybe we were the last generation maybe that came before fast fashion? I'm curious to know what you think.
Yeah, that's interesting. Well, I mean, I have to be honest, I haven't
Really heard it.
yeah, I mean, I'd certainly think that we probably are the last generation where everything wasn't disposable. Now, obviously there is a bit of a turning of that now and a reaction to some of that. But yeah, you're right. I mean, we did have bottle return. Yes, you're right. We didn't have fast fashion in the same way. I guess people bought less, but slightly higher quality. There wasn't a price discrepancy generally between fashion retailers either. Obviously, you always had luxury, but probably between premium and kind of mainstream, the pricing wasn't dramatically different. Whereas obviously we've had this huge rise of discounters as well now. So there are certain retailers clearly where you can go and buy extremely cheaply, which does obviously encourage that kind of disposability.
I always think the white so I think Wrap did a really good study with the University of Sheffield, and I think they did it with 50 white t-shirts, and they tested them for durability and wear. And these are t-shirts that went from £2, £1, £2 up to £300-400 t-shirts. And interestingly, they said from a wear perspective, the ones that were so heavily organic cotton at the top end of the scale wore the worst. And actually some of the ones at the bottom of the scale, because they had blended things like polyester in them, actually wore and lasted the longest. And he said part of the debate is when we look at fast fashion, that people don't realise that actually a lot of these fast fashion clothes are built to last. They're not going to biodegrade, they're not recyclable. And actually the assumption that if you're buying something more expensive and something organic, it'll last longer is not necessarily the case. And I think it's a really interesting study, but I think going one step further on consumer behaviour, I wonder if consumers actually understand the way things are made. And it's something I'm probably going to be a little bit more curious about going into when I'm talking to just generally people and when we're doing some research going forward. It's like, do we think if consumers understood how things were made and that it's not all just spat out by a machine, that actually the majority of fashion is still people at sewing machines? So if people understood the process of how that was made, would they value their clothes more? Because I think people see the trends and they see the fashion, they see they can have it. But I wonder if people have lost the connection with that.
I think that the answer is almost certainly yes. I think first point I would make, going back to your example about t-shirts, is I think that shows the great dilemma about everything to do with sustainability is that it's so complicated that, are you doing wrong by doing right? And I think that is one of the things that confuses consumers. Why, when they talk about traffic light systems, although they do perhaps dumb things down, perhaps you just do need simpler ways of people being able to do what they perceive to be the right thing. But then, you need to look at food and the fact that people are very happy to eat very high processed food, even though there is quite a lot of talk about how bad that is for you. Sugars, fats, I mean, everything that goes with kind of manufacturer foods that last way longer than they should do. And yet, generally people don't seem to care. I guess that is an education piece. And Hash, when he was talking earlier on here, said that he felt that with sustainability in fashion, it went back down to education at school and about trying to bring it a real kind of awareness of it with younger people, because at the moment, going back to your point about Gen X, probably the recyclers in most families are the parents and not the kids, even though you would think the kids would be the ones screaming for everything to be put in the right boxes. But I think that's often not the case in many UK households.
So I wonder if, from a generational perspective, when kids think about sustainability, I think they're more likely to use second-hand platforms as a way to kind of feed that fast fashion appetite that they've had. And I feel like their attitude towards clothes may be different in that perspective, in terms they have it, they can sell it, rather than an understanding of actually how long it will last, or if they do need to carry on having that level of newness. I think it's such a complex area when you start looking at people's relationships to their clothes. It's formed such an important part of identity that it's a really, especially the fashion sector, it's just a really interesting sector. But I think in terms of sustainability, there is a program, a small business called Swappers. And what I loved and what's interesting about this is it's a platform for swapping clothes, but it's specifically geared at children. So they go into school, do swap events, and it's all about teaching kids that actually their clothes are made to last longer and they don't have to buy new. They can go and explore other options. And I think they even got their own brownie badge. So it's just kind of getting that ethos into kind of school age kids that there is another way to buy, there's another way to shop. So hopefully sentiments will change going forward. Last question-ish, maybe there's one or two more in this one related to it. We are in a really interesting time for retail, and there's some retailers that are just doing some super cool stuff, either from storytelling, in-store experience, or alternatively, just the way they're organising their systems and their supply chain. Which retailer, in your mind at the moment, is the one that you look at and you go, that's super cool? And for what reason?
Oh, that's another impossible question, and I'm going to avoid it. I think that
you can maybe pick a few, or just what's the thing that you're or let's reframe it. What's the trend that you're seeing within retailers at the moment that you think actually that is a fantastic direction of travel if more people went that way?
I think I'd probably pick a sector, and it's not a new sector, but I'm in admiration of the fact that they've managed to just keep it going, which is athleisure. I think that, that kind of emerged a few years ago. I mean, obviously you could argue that people like Nike have been doing it for a long time, but, perhaps not under that label as such. But, there's been such a proliferation of brands and retailers. They all seem to find their niches. They all seem to be very good at the community side and a community retail, creating their own little kind of groups. Going back to the Nike point, they've all been nibbling away at them as well. And, they're obviously trying to seek a new direction at the moment. So I think that's a sector that's been incredibly innovative, incredibly successful, and there seem to be more and more new brands coming out of that sector all the time, but probably more than you would have felt would have been sustainable.
No, you're absolutely right. They do community really well. I'm even just thinking about one particular US brand that's been particularly hard hit, which is Peloton, but their community are absolutely, they love it. They're militant about it, and it's actually spawned their athleisure wear. And I think any brand or retailer that has a community that it brings together is one that's going to thrive. I think it's probably the most sensible way to build your own resilience.
And in fact, they have just created a resale platform as well. So there's moving into that field. But there's a business that rose with the pandemic and dropped with it too.
I know.
And, defied that big expectation that there was going to be a fundamental and long-term shift towards online and home activities, if you like, and actually things have reverted much more strongly.
I think it's probably a fairly good example of resilience, because they did go through that boom and bust, and I think there was talk last year of them actually potentially going under altogether. But I think the athleisure is fairly exciting. Is there anything else that you think is interesting or should be a watch out for people, maybe in terms of operations or store experiences in European based?
I think that the biggest recent story really has been the cyber attack on M&S, and I think it's particularly resonant for two reasons. One is because it has cost Marks and Spencer a fortune. I mean, they're talking about maybe £300 million off the bottom line.
They knocked out their entire operation.
Yeah, absolutely.
Food, clothes, everything.
Clothes lengthy, there's reputational damage. I mean, in fairness to Marks and Spencer, I think after it happened, they've handled it about as well as they could have done, and they're obviously coming off 2-3 very good years. But the wider side was then clearly Co-op got hit, a section of Harrods got hit, Victoria's Secret in the US was a major supplier into Whole Foods that got hit, and there was empty shelves for certain categories for Whole Foods. So within the space of a few weeks, it was hit very hard. In fact, I was at another conference where someone was talking about data as kind of a sovereign fact, and saying that we used to live in a world of rules and now we live in a world of no rules, and particularly Russian and North Korean cyber attacks are giving us that sense of lawlessness about certain aspects. And I think the retailers have been pushing very hard to make all their channels seamless. They've been looking at how their socials and their e-commerce work with their stores and all the things they do to minimize basket people abandoning baskets. I'm sure they have been taking cybersecurity seriously, but I think they'll be taking it a hell of a lot more seriously now. And I think that may well be a big topic for the next 12, 24 months.
I was at an InfoSec conference last year, and they were talking about retail and cybersecurity. And actually, when you look at some of I'm sure they will be taking it a lot more seriously, but I think there are also some places where potentially they aren't or didn't consider as risks. But I think, again, when you consider we're living in a volatile environment and risks are coming from everywhere, it's just another one to add to your profile.
Certainly is, yes.
Right, Mark, thank you so much. I've loved chatting to you. It's a very different conversation. Usually we speak to lots of retailers, but it's great to talk to somebody who has more of a bird's eye view. So thank you for your time.
No, it's a pleasure. Thanks very much.
Thank you.